Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the 1920s. The 1920s has a reputation for being this time of, even though it's during Prohibition, it's this time of drinking and partying and good times. Where people, just like the Great Gatsby, people feel like they're on top of the world. They had just gotten through, one of the most awful times in history, which is World War One, and things are good and people are celebrating. That's very misleading. That's really not what the 20s are actually like at all. The 1920s are a time of great conflict. Even though a lot of people feel good because they are able to, credit has become this kind of like normal thing by the 1920s. The average person can purchase things even though they don't have the cash for it. So people kind of feel like they're rich. People are investing in the stock market, but they're doing it very irresponsibly. So they feel like they have more money than they actually have. They thought that they just fought the war to end all wars, which was World War One. Clearly, they didn't know that there was going to be a sequel, World War II. And so, people kind of on the surface, look and feel like they're doing all right, but underneath there's lots of conflict and there's lots of issues going on. So there are more problems than what people may have recognized. One of the first issues is that the army is going to demobilize, which means that all the soldiers are going to go from being soldiers to back to civilian life. And that's going to cause some problems. It's going to cause problems for a couple different reasons. Those soldiers, which are mostly, white soldiers, are coming back, and they left jobs behind, good paying factory jobs behind in the north, and they expect to get those jobs back. But during World War One, we got to remember the Great Migration happened, and lots of young African American men moved north and took those jobs, and they kept our country running, and they helped us win this war, and it allowed those young African American men to escape the crushing poverty that sharecropping in the South had really put on African Americans, and so those young African Americans aren't going to want to give those jobs back, and rightfully so. And these soldiers that are looking for jobs now are going to start to blame African Americans for that, and it's going to cause some racial tensions. But we're also going to see that these businesses that converted to making wartime products, the government helped them convert their industry to make guns and bullets and things like that for the war effort. But when it's time to convert back to, soda pop, making soda pop machines and mechanical pencils, the government's not going to help with that, and so there's going to be issues with that. That's going to lead to high unemployment. Society. One thing about employment is when everybody's working, we tend to get along. There tends to be, things tend to be peaceful. But when we see high unemployment, we're going to see, a lot of social pressure. And unfortunately, at this time, it's going to lead to a lot of racial tensions as well. I think, neither side is really kind of willing to look at the other and see, well, they're just trying to do what's best for their family. It's I got to get mine first. And that's going to lead to some pretty serious problems. And we'll talk about that, the racial rioting. In a later lesson. Women are going to be leaving the workforce and heading back into the home. The cult of domesticity is slowly going away, but it is still there. Women took jobs. Women didn't really in World War One work in the factory as much as they do during World War II, but some did. Women took on secretarial roles, clerk jobs, things like that. While their husbands were away fighting the war, they became nurses. Things like that. And when their husbands come back home, they really feel like their husbands were gone for 2-3 years. and they feel like they're behind the curve, right? They feel like, oh, well, I should have started my family by now. I should have, be further along. We should have a house and kids. And, women are going to be anxious to leave the workforce to raise families. There's still that social pressure there on women. So they're going to head back home. Some women won't, right? We're talking generalities here, but a lot of women, most women are going to head back home. Like I said before, there's going to be an increase in racial tensions. You could see this political cartoon right here. This is President Wilson, and you could see this African-American family here. And in the background, that is East St. Louis. We're going to see we're going to specifically talk about the East St. Louis race riots, this semester. The African American woman is with her children. East St. Louis, if you can't tell in this picture really well, it's actually shown to be on fire because of the riots. It says, "Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy?" Right. Woodrow Wilson justified World War I by saying we have to protect democracies in Europe. Otherwise, the institution of democracy will fail. And what this African American woman is saying is, Mr. President, our democracy here isn't perfect. And so if we need to defend democracy in Europe, shouldn't we also be defending it here at home? And, honestly, that she makes a tremendous point that, we do have to protect it here at home. And that's the thing about democracy, right? Majority rules means that there's always somebody that's not being treated right. Democracies just aren't perfect. There's no form of government that is. And so we always have to be working on it. And it's important that we have people remind us of that. And so East St. Louis, they call it a race riot. It's really an employment riot. It's the same thing like I had said earlier in this lecture. We're going to see African Americans from the Great Migration moving up north. What's interesting in East St. Louis is the actual business owners have some fault in that. They manipulated the African American population, promised them jobs that just weren't there. African Americans flooded to East St. Louis. There weren't enough jobs for everybody because there were more workers than there were jobs. We know what that does to wages. Wages will decrease, and so those employers that used this influx of African Americans to go to their white workers and say, we're going to pay you less, or we're going to fire you and hire the African American worker, that caused resentments. There was just a minor incident, and then boom, the whole city lit up. Oh, and we'll talk about that in detail later. And that's not typical to just East St. Louis. That's typical pretty much everywhere. And then, like I said before, we're going to see industry convert from, wartime production to peacetime production. That's going to be costly. It's not going to be easy. The government, like I said, helped us convert to wartime industry, but they're not going to help us convert back. And because of that, we're going to see a slowing economy. And, one of the interesting things about the 1920s is that the economy is slowing, but people don't recognize it. Like today, if the economy slows, everybody kind of stops spending. They start saving. We all start to kind of hunker down. But in the 1920s, we're going to see the availability of credit for essentially for the first time for the average person. You can, buy an ice box from Sears and Roebuck and, pay in installment payments. And people haven't learned to be cautious of that. I'll tell you right now, all of you, this is the most important thing I'll say this entire lecture. Beware of credit cards. Credit can be evil. It can ruin your life if you, spend more money than you can pay back. And people didn't really know that back then. And so they weren't responsible. And so we have this thing where the economy's slowing. Nobody really feels it because they're able to spend all this money on credit. And then, bam, the wheels fall off the bus. And part of the reason why we get the Great Depression. So the 1920s, it's not just factory workers. That's kind of what we've been talking about so far. They're suffering. Farmers are suffering as well. That should make sense. Pre 1920s, during World War I, American farmers were feeding the world, right? I mean, feeding America and Europe, right? The British, and the French were fighting the Germans, and it was a closely fought thing. Every available man essentially either had to work in a factory to make guns and bullets or needed to be on the front and fighting. And so, how many farmers did that leave? Not very many. And so, but people still needed to eat. And so American farmers during World War I were making bank, right? Because, Europe was buying up all of our food. And this actually caused problems, like, right? I mean, like too much success. And so, small farmers that say a small farmer had 100 acres that he was, farming. All of a sudden, the American government came to that farmer and said, we need you to farm more. We need you to farm more because we need you to feed our soldiers, and we need you to feed British soldiers, and we need you to feed French soldiers. And that farmer was like, heck yeah, I'll be more than happy to farm more for you as long as you pay me. And the American government was like, yeah, made it rain, right? But farming is one of those interesting things. Can you just farm more? No, you can't, right? You got to have what? You got to have more land. You got to have more tools. You got to buy more seed. And those farmers didn't have the money for that. And so, you know what they did? They went to the bank and got a loan. And so they expanded. And for, 2 years, it was worth it, right? But, they took out those loans. They were getting paid. The smart ones were trying to pay those loans off. But, they took out more loans than money they were making because they thought that it would never end. They were always going to be selling this surplus crap. But then when the war ends, guess what the British and French soldiers do? They go back to work. They go back to farming. And so do they need our food anymore? No. And so all of a sudden now people aren't buying that food, but farmers are farming a ton of it. So now we've got surplus food. What's that do? Just like when we have surplus workers, that takes wages down. When we have surplus food, what's that do to the price of food? It falls. And so these farmers, prices all of a sudden, there's fewer people buying. They've got way more food out there than people need. Prices plummet, but guess what? They still owe their loans. And so farmers are just going to lose it. And this is another thing that's going to lead to the Great Depression. This is why we call it the Great Depression, because it affected essentially every aspect of the economy. So agricultural prices drop. I explained to you why, because we were farming so much from the war, we overproduced, and then, French and British and German soldiers went back to farming, and, all of a sudden now nobody was buying our stuff. And so farmers are really struggling. Once the Great Depression hits, these guys are going to they're losing their farms. It's going to be a really, really bad situation. We're also going to see labor unrest. During the war, we had to produce boots and, camo and bullets and guns. And, we didn't have tanks really. The British did for part of the war, but we weren't producing that, but we were producing trucks and motorcycles and things like that. And they were essential to the war effort. And so we couldn't have workers striking during the war. It was just not within our national interest. And so workers were not allowed to strike during the war. They weren't allowed to even really, in a lot of cases, demand raises. And the government just said, you got to do your part. You got to be a good American. You got to sacrifice. We're defending democracy and freedom. It's one of the most important things America does. We've talked about the pros and cons of America this entire semester, but we are a shining light for freedom in the world. We are the protector of democracy. The world is a better place because of our work doing that. And so the American government says, workers, you can't ask for raises. You can't strike during the war because we need you to do your part while the soldiers are fighting. And the workers, for the most part, said, okay. But then after, 2 or 3 years of that, without getting a raise, guess what they wanted? They wanted a raise, right? And so when the war ends, they're like, hey, war's over. We did our part. We didn't take a raise for 2 or 3 years. Guess what? Papa's got to get paid. You need to pay me more. And does that make sense? Of course that makes sense, right? The worker's totally justified in doing that. But think about it from the owner's perspective. The owner, just like the farmer, the owner of the factory was making mechanical pencils, and the government said, "Hey, I need you to convert your factory and make hand grenades, and we'll help you do that." And they did, and for a few years they made big money. But then when the war was over, does anybody need hand grenades anymore? No, it's time to convert back to mechanical pencils. Well, how many people are going to be buying mechanical pencils after a war? Right? Just not that many. And so the factory, to make all the hand grenades, the factory owner went out and bought a larger facility. He bought new equipment. The government helped them with that, but he still had to, hired more employees. And then all of a sudden demand went away. And that, although they were making money during the war was short enough that it wasn't able to pay off all their debts. And now the business all of a sudden, all of a sudden the demand has dried up for their product. And, for the most part, they're not in a position to be able to pay their workers more. And that's not, in some cases, there were greedy businessmen that just didn't want to pay their employees. Of course, that always happens, right? But the average, owner was not in a position to pay their workers more, even if they wanted to. And so that causes labor unrest. And then all of a sudden, you're going to see an increase in strikes. Workers are going to more likely want to unionize, just at a time when the world kind of looks at unions negatively, right? We had the Russian Revolution during the World War One. They became communists, and people believe that the communists are going to use the unions to infiltrate America and destroy our capitalist system. And so, and they believe that because the communists are saying they're going to do that. Now, they're not actually going to be able to do that. But at the time, we didn't know that. People just assumed, let's take them at their word, and people are really concerned about that. There's not, capitalism has its problems. And, we've talked about that in our previous lectures. We'll talk about it again in future lectures. Capitalism is certainly not a perfect system, but it has lifted more people out of poverty than any other economic system ever in the entire world. We are one of the most capitalist nations in the country, and we are definitely one of the richest. Almost everybody that lives in America, what we consider poor in America, I think is like $34,000 a year. If you make $32,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of wage earners in the world. That capitalism did that. And so these communists are saying they're going to destroy that system that made us literally, poor people in America are some of the richest people in the entire world. And so people are looking at the communists and the socialists and they're thinking, man, we don't want you to infiltrate and destroy our system. And if you're saying you're going to do that through the unions, then we're going to look at unions as kind of sketchy, they're going to look at strikes like attempts to overthrow the system. That's not what these unions are or what they're trying to do. Most of these unions are just workers that want a raise because they haven't got a raise in 3 years. But that's not how they're perceived to be at the time. They're perceived to be people trying to overthrow the system that's making, Americans, have the best life, economic life of anybody in the entire world. And so, unions get a bad rap during this time period. Like I said, the strikes are seen as un-American. They're seen as an attack on capitalism, which there's no doubt about it. People complain about capitalism all the time, and there are legitimate complaints to make. And that argument, we can always make things better. But the reality is there's no other system on the planet that's lifted more people out of poverty. As a matter of fact, you can look at Google the rates of poverty in a timeline, and you just see that as soon as you get into like the 1800s, when capitalism really kind of takes off in America and Europe, you just see total world wealth just skyrocket. It's absolutely phenomenal. And so unfortunately, labor unions get painted as being anti-capitalist, which they're not. all of this is a part of the Red Scare. And the Red Scare is essentially just the fear of socialism and communism in the United States. Communist flags are red, and so that's why it gets the term Red Scare. And we'll talk about that. We'll have a whole separate lecture on the Red Scare. It's not a thing that Americans should justifiably be afraid of in the 1920s. As a matter of fact, there's more people who claim to be socialists and communists in America right now than there were in the 1920s. And it's not a threat here in the United States today that socialists and communists are going to take over, and it's less of a threat in the 1920s, but it's new in the 1920s, and because it's new, people don't really kind of know, and so they're just more afraid. All right. So I think that's where we're going to leave off today. Just kind of a background of what's happening in the 1920s. The next series of lectures, we're going to start to talk about those conflicts that I had mentioned earlier. And those conflicts are all based around just the changing of America, right? We've been talking about slow changes in America for a while now, but in the 1920s and then I think later in the 1950s, we really start to see the modernization of America. We start to see an America that we today would kind of recognize. And so that brings conflict. It brings conflict from people who are afraid of change. And so we'll pick up with our next lecture talking about those conflicts later. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.